1999. Over Belgrade, the sky was clear, silent, and calm, until it wasn't. At precisely 2:43 a.m., a series of explosions ripped through Serbia's hardened command bunkers, air defense centers, and communication hubs. Within seconds, NATO had crippled the backbone of Yugoslavia's strategic coordination. Radar crews across the country scrambled to find the source, searching in panic across their consoles. But there was nothing. No incoming aircraft, no radar blips, no warnings, only fire. In a darkened control room near Niš, a Soviet-trained radar officer leaned over a glowing CRT screen. His eyes scanned the frequency bands, L-band, X-band, even the ancient VHF systems. Nothing, just ambient static. Then a second wave of explosions. This time, Belgrade's TV station, military police headquarters, and another hardened airfield command post were struck. Still no radar returns, still no alerts, only the seismic shake of destruction. Across the room, a Yugoslav Air Force colonel slammed his fist into a console. "Where are they?" In the corner, watching it all unfold, stood a Soviet advisor. Older, uniformed, grim. He had trained these men, designed their radar doctrine, helped deploy the very systems now being blinded. He said nothing, because he knew what had happened. The Americans had released the Ghost, the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. It had flown across the Atlantic, refueled mid-air, slipped past dozens of radar nets, and delivered precision strikes on the most heavily defended targets in Yugoslavia, all without being seen. This wasn't a fluke. This was design. A weapon created not just to avoid detection, but to erase detection as a concept. The radar screen wasn't malfunctioning, it was working perfectly. There simply was nothing to see. For the Soviet-trained officers in the room, the implications hit hard. Decades of radar doctrine, layered detection zones, and anti-stealth theorizing, annihilated in a single night. The B-2 hadn't broken through their defense grid. It had never been inside it, and that meant every radar system they'd built, every defense plan they'd trained for, and every engagement rule they'd memorized was now obsolete. The era of visible war was over, and the era of invisible dominance had just begun. From the end of World War II through the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union believed one thing above all when it came to air defense. Visibility was inevitable. No matter how fast or high an aircraft flew, it would eventually appear on radar. That was the unshakable foundation. Everything, interceptor doctrine, SAM placement, radar architecture, was built on this idea. You might not catch an American bomber at 70,000 feet with a single radar sweep, but with enough networks, with enough redundancy, something would light up. A return, a glint, a vector to track. That assumption held for decades. It survived U-2 flights, B-52 drills, even the brief shock of the SR-71 Speed, because even the Blackbird screaming over Siberia at Mach 3 was still detectable. Hard to catch, but not invisible. But invisibility? That was science fiction. Even in the 1980s, when whispers of stealth began to leak from American defense journals, when grainy satellite images revealed strange angular aircraft parked in Nevada, Soviet radar designers dismissed it. Low observable, they called it. Not undetectable, just tricky. Something that might reduce radar returns but not erase them. So they built their defenses accordingly. They layered their systems. Long-wave VHF for early detection, L-band for tracking, S-band for missile guidance. They designed overlapping radar fields, ensuring no aircraft could slip through unobserved. They deployed mobile systems, passive receivers, optical spotters. They developed doctrine for saturation fire, send enough missiles into the air and something would hit. But it all hinged on one belief, that something would be seen. When the B-2 first entered quiet service in the mid-1990s, most of this architecture remained unchanged. And in Yugoslavia, a nation still using Soviet-built radars and tactics, those same assumptions guided every response plan. If NATO struck, their operators believed, they would detect it early. Fighters would be scrambled. SAMs would track. Engagement envelopes would close. There would be a fight. But on March 24, 1999, as the first B-2s crossed Serbian airspace, those beliefs shattered. Because nothing lit up. No radar spike, no bearing to lock, no signal to chase, just targets, disappearing. The wrong assumptions had left them blind. And worse, they had trained for the wrong war. Engineers who had spent decades tweaking radar signal strength and beam width suddenly realized it was all meaningless. B-2s weren't hiding behind clouds or terrain. They were flying directly over the capital, and no one could see them. The concept of radar superiority, once the pride of Soviet air defense, was reduced to a myth. The B-2 had not beaten the network. It had nullified the entire theory behind it. The Yugoslav air defense network in 1999 was considered one of the densest and most experienced post-Soviet systems outside Russia itself. It was built to repel a Western air attack, and on paper it could. Surface-to-air missile batteries covered every major city, with mobile SA-3 and SA-6 systems providing layered defense. Each radar post had overlapping zones of responsibility, using a combination of Soviet-era long-range P-18 radars, height-finding PRV-13s, and upgraded passive detection receivers. The doctrine? Force enemy aircraft into a kill zone, detect, track, and fire in sequence. In theory, no aircraft could penetrate without triggering a response. But the B-2 didn't penetrate the system. It ignored it. Yugoslav operators followed the script perfectly that night. When early warning radars picked up electronic noise from distant NATO aircraft, possibly tankers, decoys, or AWACS, the system went live. Command centers braced for a wave of cruise missiles or a wall of fighters. They checked frequencies. They aligned fire control radars. They saw nothing. And then they heard explosions. At least 3 major command facilities were hit in the opening minutes. Hardened bunkers, fiber optic hubs, military relay towers. Yet no engagement had occurred. No enemy aircraft had appeared on scope. SAM crews had nothing to lock, not even a false alarm. The B-2 had flown directly over Yugoslavia's best defended sectors and dropped GPS-guided JDAMs without triggering a single active defense. The doctrine, once praised for its complexity, now looked like a pile of rules for a chess game no longer being played. It had been designed in an era where aircraft were loud, fast, and metallic. The F-4 Phantom, the B-52 Stratofortress, those were the enemy templates. High-altitude penetration, deep radar cross-sections, and brute force. The entire concept of layered SAM defenses assumed visibility, assumed mass. The B-2 was none of that. With a radar cross-section smaller than a bird, and a shape designed to scatter electromagnetic waves in every direction but back to the radar, it simply didn't reflect energy the way conventional aircraft did. And that meant it didn't exist on the screen. Soviet doctrine had prepared for supersonic threats, not invisible ones. No amount of triangulation could compensate. The system wasn't malfunctioning. It was operating as designed, for a world that had already ended. The B-2 didn't jam their radar. It rendered it irrelevant. The Yugoslavs realized too late. Their missiles sat idle, their interceptors grounded, and their screens blank, while their most vital infrastructure went up in flames. It wasn't a failure of courage. It was a failure of doctrine. March 24, 1999. 03:02 a.m. The Yugoslav capital was still asleep when the first wave of B-2 bombers reached their release points. Having flown over 6,000 miles from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, with 2 mid-air refuelings, they approached from high altitude undetected with 0 electronic emissions. No lights, no radar, no radio. On the ground, Serbia's most secure military communications facility, codenamed K-21, sat buried beneath reinforced concrete on the outskirts of Belgrade. Above it, radar stations scanned the sky in overlapping sweeps. Soviet advisors were confident in its survival. The site had backup generators, internal shielding, and was protected by 2 SA-6 batteries with integrated radar posts. At 03:04 a.m., the facility ceased to exist. Two 2,000-pound JDM bombs, guided by satellite coordinates and released from 40,000 feet, penetrated the roof and detonated deep within the structure. The strike was precise, surgical, devastating, and most importantly, completely invisible. Not a single radar site saw the incoming aircraft. Not one fire control system was activated. The B-2s had released their payloads and were turning for exfiltration before anyone even realized they were there. Serbian air defenses fired blind. SA-3s launched into empty sky. Radar scopes remained blank except for background noise. Several missile batteries held fire entirely, refusing to waste munitions on ghosts. At a secondary target near Novi Sad, the pattern repeated. The B-2s hit a hardened ammunition depot, destroying thousands of pounds of munitions and closing a vital logistics corridor. Again, no detection, no lock, no counterattack. Radio chatter across Serbian command centers was chaotic. "They're not in the airspace. We've lost 3 sites already. Where is the threat coming from?" Soviet advisors monitoring the strikes in real time were forced to confront the unthinkable. They weren't witnessing radar failure. They were witnessing something fundamentally new. To the advisors trained in the old doctrine, it defied reason. Aircraft were physical objects. They must generate a return, even minimal. Yet across multiple radar bands, L-band, X-band, even long-wave VHF, the sky remained empty. It was as if the weapons had fallen from nowhere. For the first time, Soviet-aligned air defense officers saw their entire strategy invalidated, not by brute force, not by overwhelming numbers, but by absence. The first impossible event had occurred, not a lucky hit, not a glitch, a deliberate strike by aircraft no one could track. And it was only the beginning. In the days following the first wave of B-2 strikes, silence fell over Moscow's Ministry of Defense. Officially, Russia had condemned NATO's actions. But privately, senior officers at the General Staff were poring over intercepted signals, damage assessments, and Yugoslav battle reports. The question was simple but terrifying. How had NATO bombed strategic targets protected by Soviet-designed air defenses without being detected? The Yugoslavs sent frantic communiques to their former patrons. Their radars had been active. Their operators had been alert. The SA-3s, the P-18s, the spoon rests, all had been live. Yet the bombs had fallen, the bunkers were destroyed, and the radar screens had stayed empty. At first, Moscow refused to accept the implications. Top-ranking generals suggested alternate theories. Perhaps the B-2s had followed commercial airline routes, blending in with civilian traffic. Maybe decoys or electronic warfare aircraft, like the EA-6B Prowler, had masked the bombers. Perhaps jamming had confused radar operators, but none of that held up. The radar logs from Belgrade showed no abnormal signal behavior, no static bursts, no Doppler confusion, no cross-signal interference. The frequencies had been clean. The only anomaly was a total absence of radar reflection at the time of impact. A former Soviet air defense engineer put it bluntly. Our radars weren't jammed, they were ignored. Still, many within the Russian defense establishment clung to old thinking. One senior colonel dismissed the reports outright. "Every aircraft can be seen. This is propaganda." Another suggested the B-2s were never there at all, that cruise missiles had been misidentified as bombs. But then came the satellite imagery. U.S. reconnaissance released declassified footage showing bomb craters. Some within meters of designated targets, all attributed to direct aerial strikes, not standoff weapons. The craters were too deep, too precise, and too synchronized for cruise missiles. There was no denying it now. The B-2 had struck deep inside one of the most defended cities in Europe and left no trace on radar. The implications rippled through every military institute in Russia. If the B-2 was truly invisible to Soviet-era radar, then it wasn't just Yugoslavia that was vulnerable. It was everyone. From Kaliningrad to Vladivostok, every radar battery, every SAM site, every interceptor doctrine depended on seeing the enemy first. If that was no longer guaranteed, then nothing was. But pride is a stubborn force. Instead of re-evaluating the entire foundation of their defense, many in Moscow chose denial. They launched investigations. They blamed operator error. They theorized about atmospheric distortion and radar anomalies. The truth? They just didn't want to admit what had happened. That American stealth wasn't experimental anymore. It was operational. It was strategic. And it was redefining warfare before their eyes. In the aftermath of the B-2's untraceable strikes, the Russian defense community didn't stay silent. But instead of accepting the brutal reality of radar irrelevance, a new theory began to circulate, a theory that comforted rather than corrected. It went like this: stealth is only directional. According to this belief, stealth aircraft like the B-2 were designed to evade detection only from head-on radar sweeps. From the right angles, the theory went, they could be seen. From the sides, from above, from beneath. Somewhere, radar would catch them. The system just needed to adjust, switch bands, rotate frequencies, use multi-static radar arrays to triangulate a return. This became the new orthodoxy in Moscow. It wasn't that Soviet radar had failed. It was that it hadn't been configured to the right geometry, that the Americans had exploited blind spots, not technological supremacy. This theory was deeply appealing. It allowed generals to preserve the illusion that with minor upgrades their legacy systems could still compete, that they didn't need a full redesign, that the B-2 wasn't invisible, just invisible from certain angles. So they doubled down. Radar scientists proposed adding bistatic receivers to traditional radar posts, receiving stations that would catch scatter from a different angle. Others advocated for integrating thermal detection and passive listening devices, an old Soviet concept repackaged as multispectrum fusion. There was even talk of using radar reflection mapping, blanketing an area with wideband energy and measuring discrepancies in background radiation to identify intruders. But none of it worked. In real-world testing, limited as it was, none of the theories produced consistent results. The B-2, with its flying wing design, radar-absorbent materials, and no vertical surfaces, offered no reliable return at any angle. It didn't just deflect radar. It devoured it. Its skin dispersed electromagnetic energy. Its exhaust was cooled to avoid infrared detection. Its flight profile avoided predictable vectors. It emitted nothing, not even radio. The bomber was as close to a ghost as any machine had ever come. Yet still, the directional stealth theory persisted. It was easier to believe the B-2 could be beaten with geometry than to admit the truth, that it had rewritten the laws of radar warfare. Because admitting that meant confronting a terrifying thought, that a multi-billion-dollar Soviet air defense architecture, decades in the making, had been rendered obsolete in a single night. And that was a truth no theory could make less painful. When directional stealth failed to explain the radar blackout, Soviet-aligned analysts turned to a new justification, one grounded in missile doctrine rather than detection. The ambush theory. According to this model, stealth aircraft like the B-2 could be neutralized by carefully laid traps. Since radar tracking was unreliable, the answer, they said, was saturation fire and pre-positioned missile zones. If radar couldn't see, then perhaps intuition could strike. The idea wasn't entirely new. Soviet manuals had always included fallback procedures for degraded radar environments, firing SAMs at suspected air corridors based on time, altitude, and previous targeting patterns. In theory, even a ghost could be caught if you fired enough nets across its likely path. So they tried. During NATO's bombing campaign, Yugoslav forces began repositioning SA-3 and SA-6 batteries every 48 hours, attempting to predict the next B-2 path. SAM operators were ordered to launch without radar locks, blind ballistic firings based on estimates and desperation. In one instance, 6 missiles were launched at a suspected B-2 approach corridor northeast of Belgrade. The radar was silent, but signal intelligence suggested a dark zone over the area, interpreted as stealth penetration. The result? Nothing. No kill, no explosion, not even a visual confirmation. The B-2s had already dropped their payload and were miles away when the missiles soared skyward. Another attempt saw a mobile SA-3 battery fire preemptively into a suspected J-dam trajectory, hoping to catch the bomber mid-run. Again, no success. The B-2s were not just stealthy in flight. They were strategically untouchable. By the time you guessed where they weren't there anymore. Still, the ambush theory gained traction in Russian journals. Military papers described hypothetical scenarios where B-2s could be trapped using concentric missile rings, heat-seeking decoys, or triangulated artillery barrages. Some even proposed airborne interception using high-speed interceptors sent blind into suspected approach vectors. But every variation failed to account for one brutal truth. The B-2 didn't fly predictable paths. Its missions were plotted via satellite intelligence. Its routes were non-linear, variable in altitude and heading. Its onboard navigation suite allowed for mid-course corrections in real time. And its timing, coordinated with other NATO forces, ensured minimal exposure at every stage. It wasn't flying through the kill zone. It was flying around the concept of a kill zone. This was the flaw in the second theory. It treated stealth like a weakness to be outmaneuvered, rather than what it truly was, a strategic immunity to traditional defense. No ambush could succeed. Because the B-2 didn't need to fight radar, it simply made radar irrelevant. In retrospect, the most stunning aspect of the B-2's success wasn't the stealth. It was that nobody in the Soviet military took it seriously before it struck. For nearly 2 decades, U.S. defense circles had discussed stealth openly enough that its development was hardly a secret. DARPA had greenlit the Have Blue project in the mid-1970s. By the early 1980s, the F-117 was flying. In 1988, the Pentagon publicly unveiled the B-2 Spirit, a tailless flying wing with no vertical stabilizers, its very shape a radar-evading marvel. The image was published globally, and yet Soviet intelligence largely dismissed it. In the 1980s, GRU analysts assigned to study U.S. aircraft procurement described stealth as a conceptual threat, not an operational one. Their assessment stated that while low observable design might reduce radar returns in theory, the idea that any aircraft could become undetectable was technically implausible. They assumed American claims were part of an information campaign, psychological warfare meant to spook Soviet defense spending into chasing shadows. After all, the F-117 was small, carried limited munitions, and had design trade-offs. The B-2, though larger, was too expensive to be built in numbers. The Soviets were convinced the U.S. wouldn't stake a major strategic system on something so seemingly unproven. But they were wrong. American stealth wasn't just a side project. It was the new core of strategic air power. And the failure to understand this wasn't limited to theory. It infected practice. By the time the B-2 entered service in 1997, Russia had inherited the Soviet blind spots. Intelligence sharing with Yugoslavia was limited, and the few reports from GRU observers inside Serbia prior to the bombing campaign did not flag stealth as a critical threat. Even after the F-117's performance in Panama in the Gulf War, Russian analysts doubled down. They explained away F-117's success as a result of weak enemy defenses or electronic jamming, not invisibility. When a lone F-117 was shot down over Serbia later in the campaign, the Russian press seized on it as proof that stealth had limits, ignoring the hundreds of other undetected sorties. But the B-2 was a different beast. Its radar cross-section wasn't just small. It was near zero. Its mission profiles were carefully planned with real-time intelligence and total radio silence. Its radar-absorbent materials were layered over a body built to scatter, not reflect, electromagnetic waves. And most damning of all, it worked exactly as advertised. The B-2 destroyed hardened bunkers, command nodes, and communications centers under the noses of radar crews trained in Soviet doctrine. And it did so without being seen, tracked, or engaged. The intelligence failure was complete, not because the data wasn't available, but because the minds trained to interpret it refused to believe that a warplane could render everything they'd ever built obsolete. And that refusal allowed the future to fly past them, undetected, unchallenged, and unstoppable. What made the B-2 Spirit terrifying wasn't just its stealth. It was the system behind it, a web of technologies, doctrines, and capabilities that fused into a weapon unlike anything the Soviet Union had ever faced. Stealth was the tip of the spear, but the blade was something deeper, total strategic integration. The B-2 wasn't designed to outfly Soviet interceptors or outmaneuver SAMs. It was designed to make them irrelevant, by being undetectable, unreachable, and most devastating of all, unanticipated. The aircraft itself was an engineering anomaly. Its flying wing design, a revival of 1940s German experimentation, lacked any vertical surfaces. That meant radar waves had almost nothing to reflect off. Its body was coated in radar-absorbent material. Its engine intakes were buried deep within the fuselage, minimizing both heat signature and acoustic noise. Exhaust was cooled and directed along flattened nozzles to evade infrared detection. On radar, it appeared, if it appeared at all, smaller than a bird. But the real power lay in its mission architecture. Every B-2 strike was planned using the full depth of American reconnaissance. Satellites provided thermal and electromagnetic mapping of enemy radar zones. AWACS aircraft monitored airspace hours before the B-2 ever crossed a border. Ground-based analysts updated flight plans in near real time, giving each bomber the most efficient, least detectable path to its target. And then there were the weapons. The B-2 carried the JDAM, the Joint Direct Attack Munition, an unguided bomb fitted with a GPS guidance kit. It allowed B-2s to strike within 13 meters of any coordinate. From 40,000 feet in total darkness, in complete silence. No laser targeting, no radio call-ins, just satellite data, precise coordinates, and gravity. Even more impressive, the B-2 could carry up to 80 JDAMs at once. That meant one bomber could simultaneously destroy 80 separate targets, each precisely mapped before takeoff. No other aircraft in the world, then or now, could match that. And it did all this while flying from halfway around the planet. Each mission began at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. The aircraft would take off, refuel mid-air over the Atlantic, penetrate enemy airspace, drop its payload, then turn around and fly home, often spending over 30 hours in continuous flight. The target might be Serbia, Afghanistan, Libya, or Iraq. It didn't matter. No forward base required. No refueling tanker loitering in hostile airspace. Just a single bomber, launching from American soil, crippling enemy command infrastructure, and vanishing. This global reach changed the equation. The Soviet concept of air defense relied on warning time. Fighters had to scramble, SAMs had to be brought online. Communications had to flow from radar posts to headquarters to launch teams. That took minutes. The B-2 operated on a timeline measured in seconds. It appeared, struck, and exited, without detection, without warning, and without retaliation. This was the real revolution, not just stealth, but the elimination of the engagement cycle. There was no dogfight, no missile duel, no radar lock, only a single thought shared by every Soviet-trained commander the moment after impact. We never saw it coming. By the third night of NATO's Operation Allied Force, the Serbian command infrastructure was in ruins. The B-2s had struck every major strategic node in the country with surgical precision. Military communication hubs, hardened command bunkers, and intelligence centers were obliterated. Not just damaged, but erased. No air battle had occurred. No enemy aircraft had been seen. No SAM had found its mark. What unfolded over Yugoslavia wasn't war in the traditional sense. It was a demonstration, a showcase of what happens when one side builds for the last war, while the other prepares for the next. Soviet advisors embedded with Yugoslav units watched in disbelief. These were men who had spent their careers fine-tuning radar arrays, calibrating missile thresholds, and drawing intricate defense networks with compasses and protractors. They knew their doctrine. They knew their math, and yet their systems sat useless as bunkers exploded, and radar screens showed only silence. In one of the most humiliating episodes, Serbian commanders tried launching SAMs blind into areas where they suspected B-2s might be flying, based on when previous strikes had occurred. But the B-2s had already adapted. Each flight followed a new route, a new time window, a new altitude. It wasn't just technological superiority. It was operational agility. No Yugoslav pilot ever saw a B-2. No radar operator ever tracked one. Even the most modern SA-6 batteries, upgraded with better targeting systems, couldn't find a target to lock. And the cost? Not a single B-2 was shot down. Not a single B-2 was damaged. Every mission returned to base intact. The most heavily defended zones, places where Soviet doctrine said no aircraft can survive, became corridors of one-sided destruction. Even worse for the advisors, this wasn't a strike fighter or a tactical jet. This was a strategic bomber, the crown jewel of American long-range power projection. It had flown from Missouri to Belgrade and back without ever being touched. Soviet-era bombers like the Tu-95 or Tu-160 could only dream of such impunity, and the psychological damage was immense. Serbian units began turning off their radar systems preemptively, fearing that activating them would only paint a target on their position. SAM crews were paralyzed, unable to detect, unable to engage, and knowing that at any moment they might be struck by a bomber they would never see. One Serbian colonel was overheard muttering, "We are defending the sky from ghosts." The humiliation extended beyond the battlefield. In military journals across Europe and Russia, analysts began to publicly question the viability of Soviet air defense doctrine. Export customers in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia raised concerns about the systems they had purchased. If the B-2 could ignore Yugoslavia's dense network, what chance did others have? The lesson was clear. Soviet-designed radar and missile systems had not just failed to stop the B-2. They had failed to even acknowledge its presence. And that wasn't a defeat. It was a redefinition of defeat itself. The B-2 didn't just destroy targets, it destroyed confidence. In the weeks following the initial strikes on Yugoslavia, the implications swept across Russia's military command structure like a virus. If the most advanced Soviet-style integrated air defense network outside of Russia could be bypassed so completely, then the problem wasn't local. It was systemic. Strategists at Russia's General Staff convened urgent reviews. Classified simulations were rerun. Soviet-era interception models based on radar lock, triangulation, and missile saturation suddenly looked like relics of a vanished era. These weren't just tactical shortcomings. This was a collapse of doctrine. For decades, Soviet ideology held that air superiority could be countered with enough layers: long-range early warning, mobile SAMs, optical tracking, multiband radar. Each piece supported the next. No single aircraft, no matter how advanced, could escape the net. But the B-2 had never entered the net. It had flown around the idea of it entirely. More damaging still was the philosophical blow. Soviet weapons were built for parity, if not superiority. The assumption was that any U.S. breakthrough would be met with a Soviet counter. The MiG-25 had chased the SR-71. The S-200 had answered the B-52. Everything had an answer. The B-2 had none. There was no Soviet stealth program to match it. No anti-stealth radar that worked. No interceptor fast or smart enough to engage something that didn't show up. And this asymmetry reached beyond the battlefield. Export clients began asking questions. India, Syria, Libya, nations that had bought Soviet SAMs, radar systems, and integrated defense networks, watched footage of Belgrade burning and radar operators flailing. They saw their investment in Soviet defense philosophy reduced to nothing in the face of a single American system. Confidence plummeted. Russia's defense exports suffered. So did its diplomatic leverage. The idea that Soviet systems could defend a nation from Western air power, already tested in the Gulf War, now looked absurd. Inside Russia, the psychological toll ran deeper. Military officers who had spent their lives mastering radar theory were now forced to confront the truth: that their enemies had skipped an entire generation ahead, that the playing field was not merely uneven, it was invisible. Even the elite PVO forces, the air defense branch of the Soviet and Russian military, faced a crisis of identity. If a bomber could strike without detection, what was their purpose? How do you intercept a threat you can't even acknowledge? This was the real collapse, not of steel or circuitry, but of ideology. The Cold War had taught the Soviets to believe in balance, to believe in symmetry. But the B-2 shattered that. It didn't defeat Soviet air defense, it rendered it conceptually meaningless. And in doing so, it signaled that the future belonged not to those who could match firepower, but to those who could erase the battlefield altogether. Today, the B-2 Spirit still flies. With fewer than 20 ever built, it remains one of the rarest aircraft in modern military service, yet also one of the most feared. Its wingspan rivals a 747, but it casts no shadow on radar. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't seek confrontation. It simply appears, delivers devastation, and vanishes. For the Soviet-trained generation, the B-2 was not just a new aircraft. It was the end of an era, a final punctuation mark on decades of Cold War doctrine that once promised parity through complexity, overwhelming fire, and radar supremacy. It didn't matter, because the B-2 wasn't designed to be better at surviving in a contested airspace. It was designed so the contest would never occur, and in that sense, it represents more than stealth. It represents the ultimate expression of American air power, not domination through numbers or brute force, but through disappearance. In modern Russia, the memory still stings. New generation systems like the S-400 promise anti-stealth capabilities. New radars claim to pierce the fog of low observable flight. Yet no Russian operator has ever faced a B-2 in combat. No system has ever proven it can shoot one down. The myth persists because the record remains unbroken. And so does the silence. Because the last thing many Soviet-aligned officers heard during the 1999 strikes was nothing. No warning, no radar alert, no aircraft call sign. Just explosions in the dark, and an empty screen that confirmed their worst fear. The enemy had flown straight through their defenses, and they had never even known. That ghost still haunts the legacy of the Cold War, not as a weapon of mass destruction, but as a symbol of strategic irrelevance, gliding silently over the doctrines it buried. The B-2 didn't just beat Soviet systems, it erased them.